Plessy versus Ferguson is a case that was heard before the Supreme Court in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1896. Homer Plessy was a man of mixed African and European descent, which allowed him to pass as white in appearance. Homer Plessy sat in a white only section in a car train because he was part of a planned legal challenge to Louisiana's segregation laws. And due to his mixed race, he appeared light skinned enough to be considered white, allowing him to sit in a white only section to test the law and bring the case to court. Essentially, he was chosen to deliberately violate the segregation law to challenge its constitutionality. During Plessy versus Ferguson, African American civil rights were neglected. According to the National Archives, segregation was soon extended to most public and semi-public facilities through Jim Crow laws. States began to require that railroads have separate accommodations for each race in the beginning passage of an 1877 Florida law. These measures were unpopular with the railway companies that bore the expenses of adding Jim Crow cars. Segregation of the railroads was even more objectionable to black citizens who saw segregation as a further step toward the total repudiation of the three constitutional amendments. The black community of New Orleans protested vigorously. However, the law was still passed because of Jim Crow. Segregated accommodations had to be made for each race. Civil rights were neglected. According to National Archives, if the civil and political rights of both races be equal, one cannot be inferior to the other civilly or politically. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane. This ruling reinforced the Separate but Equal Act that legitimized racial segregation in public and private settings. During the events of Plessy versus Ferguson, Louisiana was enforcing the Separate Car Act of 1890, which served as a foundational pillar of racial segregation, institutionalized discrimination, and enforcing the social divide between races. Additionally, the Separate Car Act required that white and black passengers be separated on trains and that passengers cannot sit in a car other than the one assigned to them based on race. The law was challenged by Plessy. Plessy agreed to participate in the test to challenge the law. Plessy was arrested after he refused to leave that white-only car train in Louisiana. His lawyers argued that the law violated the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled 7-1 in favor of Louisiana, upholding the law. Segregated public accommodations was discrimination that was practiced by a society that saw blacks as inferior, and for that reason, they wanted to keep blacks in places that were separated from places that were assigned to whites. In the Plessy case, public accommodations were railway carriages wanted to keep black and white passengers separated from each other on trains in Louisiana. The Supreme Court upheld these accommodations as constitutional under the Separate but Equal doctrine. The doctrine allowed racial segregation in public facilities like trains, as long as the facilities provided for each race were considered equal. Because the separate facilities were viewed as equal, this is why the Supreme Court ruled that segregation did not violate the 13th as well as the 14th Amendment. A badge of inferiority was a sign that someone was considered to be of lesser status. In the Plessy versus Ferguson case, the segregated train car was considered a badge of inferiority by many because it forced black passengers to be separated from white passengers, signifying their lesser status. In its ruling, the court denied that segregated railroad cars for black people were necessarily inferior. We consider the underlying fallacy of Plessy's argument. Justice Harry Billen Brown wrote, to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamped the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put the construction upon it. In the eyes of the courts, the badge of inferiority only exists if that was the way that blacks interpreted it. The impact of Plessy versus Ferguson extended far beyond the institutions it directly affected, shaping the racial attitudes and policies of American society. Victims of racial discrimination were told to seek relief not from the federal government, but from the states. It effectively sanctioned a racial caste system and reinforced the notion that African Americans were second-class citizens. The ruling also bolstered white supremacy organizations as it provided legal backing to a social order that sought to exclude Black Americans from full participation in society as a whole. Segregation became so deeply ingrained in the fabric of American life that challenging it seemed to be nearly impossible, and those who did face significant danger and persecution. This bleak reality created a sense of hopelessness for African Americans, but also ignited a long-standing resistance movement in the mid 20th century. Today, Plessy versus Ferguson serves as a reminder of both the resilience and the institutionalized racism and the power of judicial precedent. The case illustrates how a single Supreme Court ruling can legitimize and perpetuate discrimination, affecting generations of citizens to come across housing discriminatory practices such as redlining and restrictive covenants kept Black families and other minorities confined to Pacific, often overcrowded and underfunded areas. It also underscores the importance of the judiciary in interpreting and upholding constitutional value, highlighting the role of dissenting opinions like that of Justice Harlan, which provided a moral counterpoint to the majority ruling. The eventual overturning of Plessy through Brown versus Board of Education demonstrates the capacity for social and legal change, emphasizing the importance of persistence, activism, and strategic legal challenges in achieving justice. In the end, Plessy did not win the case, but the case did get appealed in Brown versus Education, marked the end of separate but equal.